Asta Nielsen is considered the greatest Danish actor of the 1910s and has been credited with the honor of being the first international star. Her German fans would refer to her as Die Asta, or the Asta, for she would make 70 of her 74 films for Germany. Adolf Hitler offered her an opportunity to own her own film company that would be financed by the state. All she had to do was to create political films to promote his plans for Berlin. Asta said no to Hitler and the Third Reich. She would leave Germany, lose her German friends, money, and any opportunity to rejoin the stage in which she so loved. Yet newspapers would say that Asta Nielsen was an enthusiastic supporter of the Nazis. Her choice to follow her convictions came with a price. As she is quoted as saying, "One just has to pay the price, as I did," in full. The icon of the screen, Asta Nielsen, would come from humble beginnings. Born on September 11, 1888, in the Vesterbro district of Copenhagen, Denmark, she was the second child of Jens and Ida Nielsen. Her sister was named Johanni, and they were complete opposites in appearance, but totally devoted to each other always. Where Johanni was blonde and blue-eyed, Asta had dark brown hair and enormous dark eyes. At the time of Asta's birth, the family was in absolute poverty. In her memoirs, Asta wrote, "It was an utterly hopeless period of poverty and illness for my family when I came into the world. My father was so ill and weak at the time that he could only walk around by leaning against walls. He didn't even have the strength to take his newborn daughter in his arms. There was no fuel for the tile stove. The pantry was empty." 3 years before she was born, her father had been in a scaffolding accident. While visiting his brother-in-law's building site, he stepped onto the scaffolding of the 5th floor, and the whole thing came crashing down. He was able to throw himself across the base and plant his feet against one wall and his back against another wall. He had stopped the scaffolding from killing one of the workers, but in holding up that tremendous amount of weight and pressure, it would damage his heart terribly. For the rest of his life, her father would be in almost constant pain and illness, with a short reprieve that would make him able to work and earn money. Life was no better for her sister Johanni. Johanni would have one life-threatening illness after another, and Asta would recall that she could not remember a time in her life when Johanni was completely healthy. Johanni suffered from rheumatic fever, which had weakened her heart. This left Asta's mother, Ida, to bear the weight of tending to the family, while making as much money as she could from doing laundry, scrubbing stairs, and mending flour sacks. During her childhood, Asta would remember having to move a lot, from Denmark to Sweden and later back to Denmark. At times, to make ends meet, the Nielsen family would have to sell off almost all of their belongings. Asta's father would try to work as much as he could until the ongoing pain would make him have to stop, or if the job came to an end, with no fault on him. Asta was a very good student, but would spend most of her time either with her sister or reading books she would find in the house. One story that left a mark on Asta was Isbin's Brand. She was captivated by one part of the story that told of the character Agnes, lying in front of the dresser holding the clothes of her dead child. Asta would silently act out this scene and found herself entranced by the idea of becoming a theater actress. Asta, Johanni, and their two cousins would make up their own plays, with Asta usually in the starring role, and performing them for one another. On August 16th, 1895, Asta's father would pass away. That September, she would turn 14 and receive the sacrament of confirmation on the 29th. Now that she had completed her studies, it was time to help her mother and sister earn money. Her mother thought she should become a sales clerk in a store and work her way up to salesgirl. But this was not for Asta. She still wanted to pursue a stage career, which her mother would never allow. Johanni, however, supported her sister's career aspirations. She would go to the Royal Danish Theatre to make her case on why she should be allowed to audition to become part of the troupe. She would meet Peter Jørndorf. Mr. Jørndorf had been a Danish actor and singer who was now teaching dictation and acting at the theater. He told her that she could audition for him at his home when she was thoroughly prepared. When she finally auditioned for Mr. Jørndorf, she told him that she'd chosen a scene from Isbin's Brand, the Agnes scene she had known by heart. He got his copy of the book and said he would read lines with her, but she spoke no words. He asked her if she had forgotten her lines. Asta wanted to perform the scene for him from her feelings and not the words. He was not happy about this and told her, "How else shall I judge your abilities as an actor if you don't speak?" He would help her find new pieces to study and memorize. He would even lend her his own books to prepare. She would audition again for him, and he felt that she was suited for the stage, but that she should still take lessons. He questioned if she could afford this, which she could not, so he took her on as his own pupil for free, and would have her also study with a linguist, Miss Ljunggren, and with a dance teacher, Miss Johanni Petersen. With the years of study and help and encouragement from her sister, Asta would audition for and get placed in the Royal Danish Theatre in 1900. She would have small parts, but no sizable roles to make her debut. In 1901, she would give birth to her daughter, Gesta. For the rest of her life, Asta would refuse to ever reveal who her daughter's father was. If she did, she would lose her voice and position in the Royal Theatre. One cannot help but wonder if Mr. Jørndorf's free lessons were not so free after all. She would join the Dagmar Theatre, but there too she did not get many substantial roles. 8 of the Dagmar Theatre's prominent actors would break from the theater to start their own troupe and create a new theater in Copenhagen. While plans for the construction of the theater were in the works, the troupe would take their show on the road and tour through Norway and Sweden. Asta was asked to join these artists, and she agreed. Here might be her chance to get the role she desired to portray. While on tour, she would again play small roles, but the versatility in those roles had people noticing her. The new theater in Copenhagen would be a bust, with many of the main 8 actors finding jobs easily with other theaters. Luckily for Asta, and a few others, one of the stars of the group, Mr. Peter Fjelstrup, would hire them as young actors for the next year. She would take over a large part of the prima donna roles, since many of the 8 of the group were gone. When Fjelstrup's tour was completed, she was offered a 3-year contract with the new theater in Copenhagen. The actor, Viggo Lindström, had better luck than the other 8 to have actually gotten this theater built. Asta was ecstatic. This theater would open in the fall of 1908. During the first season, Asta would meet Norwegian author Thomas Craig. He had admired Asta when she was touring with the Eight and now at the New Theater. He had written both a play and a film that he wanted her to star in. The play was unfortunately not suitable for the New Theater's repertory, but the film was liked, and his only condition for making this film was that Asta was to play the leading role. At this time, Asta had no interest in film acting, as many theater players did. Acting in films was entertainment for street urchins, and not for the respectable clientele she received while performing in live theater. The film would be made, but with a different leading actress. The next year at the New Theater was not a good one, and many of the cast would just sit around and collect their salaries. For months, there was nothing to do. Asta would speak with the theater's artistic advisor and painter, Urban Gad, who was in the same boat. She tells him how she had been offered a film role, and she had wished now that she had taken it. Gad thought to himself and asked her, "What if I write a film? Would you act in it?" Gad would give Asta the script for Afghanistan, or in English, The Abyss. The story is about a woman named Magda, a piano teacher. She meets a young engineer on the trolley. Their relationship blossoms into an engagement, and the young man takes Magda to meet his father, a minister, and his mother in the country. While in the country, a traveling circus comes by, and Magda meets a cowboy performer and falls immediately in love with him. They run away together. The performer constantly cheats on her, yet she follows him everywhere. One day, her ex-fiancé sees her on the street and follows her to a boarding house. While playing the piano, a waiter gives a message from the ex to meet him. The waiter also tells Magda's boyfriend, who catches Magda and her ex together. A fight ensues. Magda ends up killing her boyfriend. The police are called and she is taken away. Asta loved the idea of finally getting to play the dramatic role she had dreamt for so long. A friend of Urban Gad's owned a cinema and was willing to help them get the 8,000 kroner to make the film. Urban would direct, and actor Paul Rumert would play the male lead. The film would start production in June of 1910, during their summer break, and with only 8 days to complete the entire film. Their money situation only gave them that amount of time, and no more. Asta would write in her memoirs of the premiere and the film's success. The film's premiere at the Kosmorama was nothing less than a sensational success. The film was soon to be shown across the entire world, and everyone agreed that it signaled the birth of artistic film, marking a turning point in the history of the medium. Magazines that had never before published positive articles about film now praised this first evidence of the film's artistic qualifications, and even though the film was exported around the world without the actors' names mentioned in it, Asta would later remark, "My name rose everywhere, like a phoenix from the ashes." Letters from every corner of the world began flooding in, and the fairy tale of film became real to me. She was even offered a contract at the Royal Danish Theatre, but she wanted to continue making movies. Her next starring role was in The Black Dream, produced by the company Fotorama. And then she would receive an offer to make 2 films with Deutsche Bioskop in Berlin, and Urban Gad was contracted to both write and direct those films. These films were The Burning Blood and Retribution. Following these films, Deutsche Bioskop would extend her contract for an additional 8 films, and Gad would again be hired to write and direct. Around this time, an Austrian film distributor would orchestrate an agreement among several German film production companies, that included PAGU and Deutsche Bioskop, to establish a new distribution company, IFVG, that would be based in Vienna and would distribute 32 Asta Nielsen films for the next 4 years. Asta's annual salary would be 80,000 German marks, and she would get 33% of the revenues made by her films. She would also have full artistic freedom in selecting screenplays, actors, costumes, and directors. A contract was also offered to Urban Gad as well. The following year, she would sign with Nordics Film. After signing, she was approached with an amazing offer. Asta would recall that a film rental company in Vienna and the Frankfurt AM, Main-based centralized cinema company Union, later UFA, together proposed to make films with me in the lead role for a period of 4 years, including the already contracted series for Bioscope. The offer was also extended to Urban Gad. That summer of 1911, Asta would complete her 8 films for the Asta Nielsen series, which ran throughout 1911 and 1912. Their titles, of which I am listing as they were known in either Great Britain or the US, were The Circus Girl, The Great Moment, Gypsy Blood, The Course of True Love, The Traitoress, Poor Jenny, The Might of Gold, and Driven Out. Her new company was building a studio where her films would be made. In 1911, she would also make a film called The Ballet Dancer, which was not part of the series, but a Danish long feature film. In the spring of 1912, Asta would move to Berlin to be closer to where her films were being made. On May 11th, she would marry her director, Urban Gad. Asta's mother, along with her sister Johanni, were taking care of her daughter, Gesta, in Denmark, while Asta was in Berlin. She would visit them on weekends and holidays. Before her departure to Berlin, Asta's mother was hospitalized with a lung infection. Ida's heart was already weak, so the doctors gave little hope of recovery. Asta spent as much time as she could with her mother, but the doctors asked her to stay away at night so that her mom could rest. The guilt Asta suffered when her mother passed away at night without her and her family plagued her for the rest of her life. For her, her mother died alone among strangers. Life was very busy for Asta. With a hectic production schedule as well as attending various publicity events, she was thoroughly worn out, not to mention being away from her daughter. The 1912-1913 season brought an additional 8 films. These titles were The Fatal Dance, Falsely Accused, When the Mask Falls, The Barefoot Dancer, Lady Madcap's Way, Behind the Comedy's Mask, The Devil's Assistant, and Spanish Blood. The 1913-1914 season debuted with an additional 7 films. These were all released prior to the outbreak of World War I. They were The Militant Suffragette, A Girl's Sacrifice, The Prima Donna, Up to Her Tricks, The Cry of a Child, Zapata's Gang, and Vengeance is Mine. She had made 7 more films in 1914, but they would be released in the 1915-1916 season. Even though she was living in Germany, Denmark was proud of their Asta. Every release of her films was a grand event. They hailed her as the most world-famous of all Danish actresses. Cinema itself, since Asta had begun her career in acting, was now being considered respectable and rivaled the stage. In 1914, World War I broke out, and Asta would decide to go back to Copenhagen. Being back home was quite a transition for her. Her days in Germany had been full of non-stop work, and now she had to get used to a quieter life. There was no film work intended while she was there. She would learn of colleagues that have headed off to war and not returned. A change of pace was definitely needed. She had been invited to come aboard a steamer owned by a few Swedish friends to sail with them to South America. The ship would be under the command of Ferdinand Freddy Wingard. He was the son of a wealthy shipbuilder in Sweden named Wilhelm Wingarden. In Asta's memoirs, she didn't speak much of him, but in the footnote, it was revealed that she had met Freddy in 1915 and had been having an affair with him, which would probably be the reason for the separation of she and Gatter that same year. In 1916, Asta, as well as Freddy, decided to return to Berlin, and she signed a contract with a distribution company for 8 films that she would make at her own expense, and the company would handle them for regular distribution. She had formed her own Berlin-based production company named Neutral Films, which was funded by her soon-to-be second husband's family. 2 of the titles released were Eskimo Baby and The ABCs of Love, but it would be in a limited circulation due to the wartime conditions. In Eskimo Baby, Asta plays an Inuit woman brought back from Greenland to the bewildered world of Berlin by the explorer Knut, played by her fiancé, Freddy. Her character is like a little child trying to find her place in this new modern world she finds herself dropped into, and hilarity ensues. In The ABCs of Love, Asta plays a girl who wants to teach her fiancé how to be a man. To do this, she dresses herself up as a man and takes her fiancé out on the town to man him up. This gender-bending character, which would be a precursor to what the film I consider her masterpiece, Hamlet, in 1920. The other films would not be released until 1918, after the war had ended. After the completion of filming, Asta decided to spend the remainder of the war in Copenhagen. She would get help with this decision from the German police. The police would come knocking at her hotel door early one morning, wanting to search her room and confiscate her luggage. She was taken to police headquarters and was finally told that an anonymous tip was given to the police that Asta was a spy and that she was attempting to smuggle films out in the furniture that she had been shipping back to Copenhagen. She had a feeling she knew who had done this to her, but refused to say who it was in her memoirs. Later, it was revealed that she thought it was her soon-to-be ex-husband, Urban Gad, whom she was in the middle of divorcing. He would have been the only one to have known her contractable rights to the prints of her Union films. Well, whoever it was that sought revenge against her would not get it. She would be released after a thorough search of her luggage was completed, but they advised her to either remain in Germany or go back to Copenhagen for the duration of the war. Going back and forth would not be advisable. Not being a very difficult decision, she opted for the latter. Feeling restless with her inability to work, she and Freddy left Copenhagen, and would yet again leave and journey to anywhere that wasn't Europe. She would visit Japan, Siberia, and then sailed to New York. From New York, she would visit friends in Canada, then return to New York. Once there, she would find all the connections of getting back to Europe would be interrupted, so she would have to stay in New York for a bit. She would spend her days taking in the city and visiting cinemas on Broadway. There, she would watch the steady streams of dramas and comedies the American film companies produced. She would learn English, though sparsely, through the title cards on the screens. While in New York, she was offered film work by Carl Laemmle and Fox Films, but she would decline these offers. All she wanted to do was go back home. Finally, after 6 months, she received special permission to sail back to Europe. She told herself that she would stay in Denmark until the end of the war. Peace finally rang out in 1918, and Asta wanted to get back to Germany and back to work. It turns out, though, that at some point during the war, Asta did make one film for the company Nordisk. Nordisk had actually continued to make films throughout the war, but due to export limitations, that would end up having a stealthy backlog of pictures to show the world. Asta's film, Toward the Light was the story of a rich baroness who changes her lifestyle to a more pious one when a young man killed himself over her love. At the end of 1919, having finally divorced Gad, Asta would marry Freddie after dating for a year. Asta was 38 and Freddie was 35. Asta would be contracted by theater director Karl Meinhard from Berlin to film Intoxication. Her director would be Ernst Lubitsch. Their relationship was a rocky one from the beginning. They would disagree on the script. Asta was not at all happy with the director's interpretation of the author Strindberg's work. If he created a scene that she was unhappy with, she would refuse to go to set. She felt that she needed no direction. Unfortunately, times were changing, and so was the art of filmmaking. New modern directors were coming into play. Fritz Lang, Ludwig Berger, F.W. Murnau, G.W. Pabst, and Ernest von Strindberg, to name a few. Asta was aware that he was considered a world-class director at this time, and she would say in an interview, he could set a scene. He understood great actors. He never interfered with what I did. He knew very well that he could not do so. I guess one thing that I could say is that they admired each other's professionalism and would just have to agree to disagree. The film would be a huge success, but it would be the only time the two worked with each other. Besides her freelancing work, Asta, funded by Freddie's family's money, would open their own production company, Art Film. This company would produce one film each year. The first and the most famous of the films, and which brought me personally into the Asta Nielsen realm, was Hamlet. Asta would star as the Danish prince, and it was not the first time that a woman would play the role. The difference was the interpretation of the story. The other actresses, such as the international theater star Sarah Bernhardt, who would take on the role as Hamlet, would play the character as though she were a man. Asta would play the role not as a prince, but as a princess disguised as a prince. This heavily criticized interpretation has Queen Gertrude, forcing the king's heir, a daughter, to spend her life pretending to be a prince. The film would become the first major international success for German films after the war. The second film from Art Film was Miss Julie, which was released in 1921. Miss Julie was a loose adaptation of August Strindberg's Miss Julie. The daughter of a count witnesses her mother's increasingly mental instability after being spurned by a lover. Her final picture from her company, released in 1923, was Downfall. Asta played Kaja Falk, a successful singer who had had a hard life. The man she loves is convicted of murder that Kaja is suspected of actually committing. He is sent to jail for 10 years, and Kaja promises to wait for him, and he in turn. He dreams of the chance of seeing her again. He only sees her from what he remembers last, but the years had been hard on her, and when he is finally released from prison, he doesn't see her anywhere. Unfortunately, she was there waiting for him, but he did not recognize her. With a grief-stricken heart, she collapses. Her co-star in Downfall was stage and film actor Grigory Chamara. Mr. Chamara fled to Berlin during the Russian Revolution. He would star in a few other films with Asta and would eventually become her third husband. Before, during, and after these films, she would continue to freelance and make other pictures. But in 1923, she and Freddie would divorce, and Asta would marry Grigory Chamara the same year. This marriage would last through 1936. The two would star in the 1923 film INRI, which was the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. Chamara would star as Jesus and Asta as Mary Magdalene. Other titles they would collaborate in were The Woman in Flames, Athletes, Battle of the Butterflies, Hedda Gabler, Living Buddhas, and The Joyless Street. In The Joyless Street, Asta would be directed by George Pabst and star with a newcomer named Greta Garbo. In an interview, Asta would speak of Pabst, who had made 2 other movies before The Joyless Love Street, that he was good at setting the scene and was a very pleasant man. One thing that they both agreed on was Garbo. Garbo was talentless. Where Garbo would later say that everything she had learned about acting was from Asta Nielsen, Asta would say about Garbo, she was the most beautiful ever, but talent, I can't find any. Asta's last silent film was That Dangerous Age in 1927. In this film, Asta plays 40-year-old Elise, who lives in a lovely house and is married to a respected professor, but feels she is reaching that dangerous age where her beauty will begin to fade and life will become dull and boring. She falls for a younger man and divorces her husband, but lives with the fear of jealousy, vanity, and possible heartache from being in love with a much younger man. Her last film, which was the only talkie she would ever perform in, was Impossible Love. It did well in European theaters, but Asta thought it was dreadful. She didn't even feel she was particularly good in it. The film was Danish, and her opinion about Danish films in general was that they did not feel as natural to her as German films. In German films, she would say that she could express herself better. She would retire from films after making The Impossible Love, which was a story about a widowed middle-aged artist who had 2 grown daughters. She meets and begins to fall in love with a famous old sculptor. They decide to marry despite the objections of her daughters. She said that she had first signed on because she was told that the character was a fit for her age and abilities, but they would not show her the script because it was being tailored to her. Once she read the script, she saw that the writers had altered the story so much from the original novel that none of it really worked. As she filmed Impossible Love, she found the acting in films no longer interested her, and she would rather continue working on stage as she had before the 1920s. She was enjoying herself in the theater, and the new technology of the film process was becoming too complicated for her way of acting. She would not have control on how she could develop her roles, as she had both pre- and post-World War I. Not to mention her age being a factor in her decision. She was 29 when she filmed The Abyss, which would be considered quite an advanced age for Hollywood, even today, to play an ingenue. Age had always been a killer of careers of women in film. It is an unfortunate fact. Asta would continue her theater work, and even Jesta, her daughter, would help her mother with touring destinations and dates. Asta loved touring and visiting new towns every day. She considered these years on the road as the happiest time of her life. Jesta would meet her future husband, Paul Vermenheim, in Berlin. He was a Danish singer, painter, and speech instructor. They married in 1929. Jesta was compared to her mother, a very plain and overweight young lady. Asta was always on her to lose weight. Jesta had diabetes due to her extra weight. Asta wanted safety and security for her daughter, and marrying Paul would hopefully give that to her. Asta also owned a small, circular cottage she called Carousel on the island of Hidden Sea. She had purchased this home in the 1920s, where she would spend the summer, often with her sister, to escape the city life and relax. Many actors, literary friends, and artists had property there due to it being so remote. There were no cars allowed on the island, and everyone would have to walk through the fields on the island to each other's homes to visit. She enjoyed that property and all the lasting memories until in 1946, when it was confiscated by the Russians to house bombed-out refugees that August. Life in Germany was gradually changing, and not in a pleasant way. In the 1930s, Germany's economy was in ruin, causing vast unemployment and poverty for its people. This state of misery opened people's minds and ears to the words and ideas of a man named Adolf Hitler. Asta would tell in an interview how she had been invited by the Ministry of Propaganda to an afternoon tea party. She had been seated next to Hitler. In her memoirs, she writes about their conversation. After discussions about the plans for Berlin, he said, "Now comes a time when we once again need the great artists of the film world." "That can hardly refer to me," she said, having retired from film and worked exclusively on the stage. "I don't belong to any political party and would never consent to acting in political films." "Nor do you need to now," the dictator replied. "It is simply that I could speak 2,000 words without being understood, but the whole world understands every single movement you make." Asta then said, "Do you mean this movement?" And she made the Nazi salute. She would say that he didn't find humor in it, and furrowed his brow. She would be offered her own film company that would be financed by the state. But Asta politely refused, offering again that she was retired. She was unhappy with all that was happening around her. She viewed Germany as her second homeland. She didn't want to live anywhere else. She would decide to leave Germany in 1937 and moved into an apartment on H.C. Ørstedvej Street in Copenhagen, Denmark. In Denmark, she would say in an interview that she wanted to start her own theater there. She was not received warmly in her actual homeland, as she had hoped she would. She would appear in a play there entitled Tony Paints a Horse in 1939. It was also during her return to Denmark that Asta's older sister, Johanni, suffered from a heart condition and died. Asta never left her side while her sister was in and out of consciousness due to the morphine injections. Johanni looked at her sister for the last time, her arms around Asta, and said, "Thank God that we have each other." Johanni would then fall asleep and never awaken. On April 9, 1940, the Germans occupied Denmark. She would be saluted by officers saying, "Ach, die Liebste," which in English means, "Oh, the darling," but she would just walk past them. That October, she would move again to Peter Bangs Vej, this apartment being far smaller due to her having to watch her expenses. She would also lose some of her German friends, which was extremely painful for her. But as she stated, she was through with the Reich. A Third Reich representative in Denmark came to her and told her that they wanted her back and that the Führer had forgiven her. Asta's response, "But I haven't forgiven die Führer." She had paid the price for her convictions. If she had stayed in Germany, she said she would not have lost her money, but she would have lived her life the way she wanted to. It would have meant living quite contrary to her convictions, which she couldn't do. She said, "One just has to pay the price, as I did in full." She had lost so much money due to the two wars. Her property in Germany was sequestered. She was unable to get a cinema license that she had wanted due to the questions of her being a Nazi. The Minister of Justice, who oversaw granting licenses to achievers from the film industry, denied her. She applied 13 times and was rejected and never told why. Terrible lies were put in the papers saying things like, Asta Nielsen says she was an enthusiastic supporter of the Nazis. She made herself anonymous and went by Miss Nielsen. She spent her time reading and painting. She would meet a young man by the name of Freddie Schmidt, who idolized Asta. He would get her books that she wanted to read, and he would learn firsthand the stories she would tell him about her life and career, and some information that Asta didn't even insert into her memoirs. One example of this was how Asta barely mentioned anything about her daughter Gesta in her memoirs. She would later say that if she discussed her daughter in the book, then there would be nothing else in it but stories of her daughter. Well, that might have been so, but I doubt she would have mentioned that Gesta was unwanted. Freddie would learn from Asta that when she found herself pregnant and not married, which at the time was an unthinkable way for a young woman to find herself, and would be stigmatized by those around her, she entered the maternity home of Copenhagen in 1901. Gesta would be born in secret on July 9th and placed up for adoption. When Asta's mother found out about this, she made Asta retrieve the baby a month later. She again, though, never revealed who the father was. Not even Gesta knew who he was. One can assume that while Asta was having her career in Germany, Gesta lived with Asta's family. Asta would also reveal to this man that Gesta's marriage to Paul was not a loving union per se, but a friendship union. As I've mentioned before, Gesta was a very quiet person who probably didn't really have anyone besides her mother. In turn, Asta was always worried about Gesta being alone, mostly due to the fact of her struggles with diabetes. Having Paul in her life was probably a big sigh of relief for Asta, though I don't know how she really felt about Paul. I think she accepted the relationship for what it was, though she would reveal to Freddie that she was not always happy with it. She would tell him how Gesta often spent most days alone, while Paul busied himself all day painting and working on other things. Asta felt that he should have spent more time with Gesta. He would leave the house, paint, come home, go to his study, then to bed, without speaking to Gesta at all. Gesta and Paul were also living off of Asta. When the couple ever had friends over or parties, Asta was sent the bills. She would also say that when she herself was at these parties, Paul acted as if Asta was the wife and not Gesta. Historians of Asta Nielsen claim that Paul was actually a homosexual, but at the time living openly was not accepted. So the marriage between friends was probably what the two thought would be best for both of them. On May 1st, 1964, Paul would go to the hospital for a series of tests and would leave with a clean bill of health. But the next morning he would suffer a heart attack and die. The death of her husband threw Gesta into a severe depression. That October she would be found dead, with a note next to her. The note was addressed to Asta and read, "Dear Mummy, my nerves are in such a state that I fear for my sanity, my future, everything. I can't go on. Thank you for everything, my darling Mummy. Gesta." She was 63 years old. In a taped conversation Asta had with a friend, she would say that Gesta was the most important thing in her life. She always had been. As the life of Asta Nielsen continued on, writing would be only one of her artistic outlets. Besides her memoirs, she wrote short stories that were published in newspapers and magazines. She also became an artist and had an exhibition of the collages she made. Asta's common-law marriage to Gregory Chamara ended before the 1940s, and through some friends decades later, she would meet an art dealer named Anders Christian Thied. He was 18 years her junior, and the two became smitten with one another. They began to spend more and more time together, and a romance bloomed. By 1969, she would spend summers at home on Mon, an island in Denmark. They would eventually marry. In an interview, Asta would say of her marriage, "It's the happiest time of my life, the years I spent with my husband. I have been married 3 times, but not happily. Now I am happy." In May of 1972, Asta had a fall in her apartment and reportedly fractured her hip. An injury like this for an older person can be catastrophic. The healing factors for elderly people is much slower than for young people. There are also possibilities of immobility, infections, subsequent surgeries, and possible cardiac arrest. On May 25th, she died at the Frederiksberg Hospital. She was 91, and her husband was by her side. She was interred at the Vestry Cemetery, where her daughter Gesta was also buried. Asta Nielsen was a woman before her time. She believed in her art and would not compromise that for the world. She was strong and cared deeply for others. She did what she felt was right and had that conviction even though she had to pay for it deeply. I hope that Asta's star will continue to grow brighter, with new generations seeing and learning more about the icon of the international screen. The woman simply known as the Asta.